Senator Margaret Hayes stepped out of the black sedan, her heels clicking against the wet pavement of London's Parliament Square. The rain had stopped just moments before, leaving the air thick with moisture and tension. She adjusted her navy blazer and checked her watch. 2:47 p.m. The emergency diplomatic meeting was scheduled to begin in 13 minutes. But something felt wrong about this entire situation. Her security detail, Agent Collins, walked beside her with measured steps. "Ma'am, I still think we should have waited for the full escort," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the unusually crowded area around Westminster Palace. Margaret shook her head, her gray hair catching the filtered sunlight that broke through the clouds. "We don't have time for protocols, Collins. The trade agreement hangs by a thread, and every minute we waste could cost American jobs." At 62, she had learned that diplomacy often meant taking calculated risks. As they approached the ornate gates of the palace, Margaret noticed something unusual. A crowd had gathered near the main entrance, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. Signs bobbed above their heads, some supporting the controversial trade deal, others demanding its immediate cancellation. The media had turned what should have been a quiet, diplomatic meeting into a public spectacle. "Senator Hayes," a reporter's voice cut through the crowd noise. "What's your response to the allegations that American companies are exploiting British workers?" Cameras flashed as more journalists pushed forward, creating a chaotic wall of bodies and equipment. Collins moved closer to Margaret, his hand instinctively moving toward his jacket. "We need to move, ma'am. This crowd is getting unpredictable." But Margaret had spent 3 decades in politics. She knew that running from the media would only fuel more speculation. Instead, she stopped and faced the cameras with the practiced calm of a seasoned politician. "The United States remains committed to fair trade practices that benefit workers on both sides of the Atlantic," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. That's when she saw him. Standing perfectly still near the palace gates was a royal guard, his red uniform immaculate despite the earlier rain. His black bearskin hat added to his imposing height, and his rifle was held at the regulation angle. But there was something in his posture, a subtle tension that Margaret's trained eye caught immediately. The crowd pressed closer, and Margaret noticed the guard's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. His eyes, though focused straight ahead as protocol, demanded seemed to be tracking something in the crowd. A bead of sweat ran down his temple despite the cool London air. "Ma'am, we really should go inside," Collins urged. But Margaret found herself studying the guard more intently. She had met enough military personnel to recognize the signs of someone under extreme stress. This wasn't the ceremonial calm of a royal guard going through his routine duties. A protester broke free from the crowd control barriers, running directly toward the palace gates while shouting about corporate greed. Other demonstrators followed, creating a surge that threatened to overwhelm the thin line of police officers trying to maintain order. The royal guard's grip on his rifle shifted slightly, and Margaret saw something that made her blood run cold. His knuckles were white, his breathing had quickened, and there was a tremor in his left hand that spoke of someone fighting an internal battle. She had seen that look before, during her visits to veterans' hospitals. Post-traumatic stress could strike anyone, anywhere, and the combination of the loud crowd, the chaos, and the pressure of his duty was clearly affecting this young soldier. Without thinking about diplomatic consequences or her own safety, Quet stepped away from Collins and walked directly toward the guard. The crowd noise seemed to fade as she focused entirely on the young man who was clearly struggling to maintain his composure. While fighting demons that nobody else could see, the royal guard's name was James Mitchell, though no one in the crowd knew that. To them, he was just another ceremonial figure, a tourist attraction in a red coat. But behind his stoic facade, James was fighting the worst panic attack he'd experienced. Since returning from his deployment in Afghanistan 6 months earlier, the sound of the angry crowd was morphing in his mind, becoming the remembered chaos of explosions and gunfire. His hands, trained to remain steady no matter the circumstances, were beginning to shake. The rifle that should have felt familiar and secure now seemed impossibly heavy. Margaret approached slowly, her diplomatic instincts telling her that sudden movements might make things worse. She had dealt with her share of crises, but nothing quite like this. As she drew closer, she could see that James was young, probably mid, with the kind of rigid posture that came from months of military training overlaying months of psychological trauma. "Collins, keep everyone back," she said quietly. Without turning around, her security agent started to protest, but something in her tone stopped him. Margaret had that effect on people when she was completely serious. The crowd continued to surge, and a photographer pushed through the police line, his camera clicking rapidly as he captured what he thought would be routine shots of the protest. The flash from his camera strobed across James's face, and Margaret saw him flinch as if he'd been struck. She was close enough now to speak to him directly, but she knew he wasn't supposed to respond. Royal Guards were trained to remain silent and motionless regardless of what happened around them. But Margaret also knew that sometimes rules had to be bent in the name of human decency. "Son," she said quietly, positioning herself between James and the crowd, "I can see you're struggling. I want you to know that you're safe here." James's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but she noticed his breathing was becoming more erratic. Sweat was now visible on his forehead, and the tremor in his hands was getting worse. The cacophony of the crowd seemed to be building to a crescendo that might push him over the edge. A group of protesters had broken through the police barriers entirely and were now running directly toward the palace gates. Their angry chants echoing off the stone walls. James's military training kicked in automatically. These were potential threats approaching his post, and his hand moved instinctively toward the trigger guard of his rifle. Margaret saw the movement and recognized the danger immediately. A trained soldier having a psychological episode while armed was a situation that could turn tragic in seconds. But instead of backing away like any rational person would do, she stepped closer. "James," she said, somehow knowing his name without being told, speaking just loudly enough for him to hear over the crowd noise. "I'm Senator Margaret Hayes from the United States. I've worked with a lot of veterans, and I know what you're going through right now." For the first time, James's eyes flickered toward her, breaking the cardinal rule of his position. The connection lasted only a second, but it was enough for Margaret to see the fear and confusion behind his professional mask. This wasn't just stress from crowd control. This was a young man reliving trauma that had nothing to do with London, protesters, and everything to do with memories that wouldn't stay buried. The crowd noise reached a new level as more people joined the demonstration, their voices mixing into an incomprehensible roar. Someone had brought a bullhorn, and the amplified voice demanding justice for workers rang out across the square like a battle cry. James's whole body went rigid, and Margaret realized they were running out of time. She could see other guards nearby starting to notice something was wrong, and police officers were moving closer to investigate why an American, Canada, was having an unauthorized conversation with one of the Queen's guards. She made a decision that would either save the situation or create an international incident. Stepping directly in front of James, she placed herself squarely in his line of sight, blocking his view of the crowd and forcing him to focus on her face instead of the chaos around them. "Look at me, James," Margaret said firmly, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding attention in the Senate. "Focus on my voice and ignore everything else." James tried to maintain his ceremonial posture, but his eyes kept darting between Margaret's face and the crowd behind her. She could see him fighting two battles at once, the external one against his training that told him to remain motionless and silent, and the internal one against memories that were threatening to overwhelm him. Agent Collins had positioned himself nearby, clearly torn between protecting his principal and respecting her apparent strategy. Other security personnel were starting to take notice of the unusual situation, but nobody seemed quite sure how to intervene when a U.S. senator was deliberately engaging with a royal guard during what appeared to be some kind of crisis. The protesters had grown more aggressive, and several were now pressing against the palace gates themselves, rattling the iron bars and shouting demands. The sound of metal clanging against metal seemed to hit James like a physical blow. Margaret watched as his knuckles went completely white on his rifle. She realized that the sounds were probably triggering memories of prison doors or military compounds under attack. "I know what you're hearing," she said, keeping her voice steady and calm despite the chaos around them. But you're not there anymore. You're in London, it's a Tuesday afternoon, and you're safe. A police officer approached from the left, clearly intending to ask Margaret to move away from the guard post. She held up her hand without looking at him, the gesture so commanding that he actually stopped mid-step. Years of political experience had taught her how to project authority even in the most unusual circumstances. James's breathing was becoming increasingly rapid and shallow. Margaret recognized the signs of hyperventilation setting in, which could quickly lead to a full collapse. She knew she had to act fast, but any wrong move could escalate the situation beyond control. "James, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said, stepping even closer despite the obvious risk. "I'm going to count backward from 10, and I want you to breathe with me. Can you do that?" For a moment, she wasn't sure he had heard her. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, and she could see that he was losing the battle to stay present in the moment. The crowd noise, the camera flashes, the general chaos of the demonstration were combining to create a perfect storm of triggers. For someone dealing with post-traumatic stress, then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. 10, Margaret began, taking a deep, visible breath. 9. She watched as James attempted to match her breathing pattern, his chest rising and falling in, sync with hers. 7. The crowd continued to shout, but she kept her voice steady and rhythmic, creating an island of calm in the middle of the storm. Behind them, the situation was becoming more complicated by the minute. Media photographers had noticed the unusual interaction between the American senator and the Royal Guard, and cameras were starting to focus on them instead of the main protest. What had begun as a private moment of crisis intervention was rapidly becoming a public spectacle. Collins spoke into his radio, probably calling for backup or guidance from the embassy. Other royal guards at nearby posts were clearly trying to figure out what was happening without breaking their own protocol. Palace security officials were having urgent conversations, no doubt trying to decide whether to intervene or let the situation play out. 6. 5, Margaret continued. Never. Taking her eyes off James, she could see that her technique was working. His breathing was starting to slow down, and some of the wild panic was leaving his eyes. 4. 3. But then a protester threw something at the palace gates. It was just a plastic bottle, harmless and probably thrown more in frustration than anger, but the sound of it hitting the iron bars rang out like a gunshot. James jerked as if he'd been struck, and Margaret saw all the progress they'd made start to unravel in an instant. His grip on the rifle shifted again. This time Margaret realized they had moved beyond a simple panic attack. The combination of his military training, his psychological trauma, and the increasingly chaotic situation had created a scenario where a trained soldier might react as if he were in actual combat rather than ceremonial duty. She had seconds to make a decision that could determine whether this situation ended peacefully or became a tragedy that would make international headlines for all the wrong reasons. Margaret made a decision that would either be remembered as an act of incredible bravery or complete madness. Instead of stepping back when she saw James's hands move on his rifle, she stepped forward and gently placed her own hands over his. The touch was electric in its unexpectedness. Royal guards were never supposed to be touched by civilians, and certainly not by foreign diplomats during a public demonstration. But Margaret wasn't thinking about protocol or international relations. She was thinking about a young man who was drowning in memories of war while surrounded by chaos that was pushing him toward a breaking point. "James, feel my hands," she said quietly, her fingers warm against his cold knuckles. "You're holding a ceremonial rifle in London, not a combat weapon in Afghanistan. The people around us are protesters with signs, not enemy combatants with guns, eh?" The crowd noise seemed to fade into the background as James focused on the unexpected sensation of human contact. For months, he had felt isolated and alone, carrying his trauma in silence. While maintaining the perfect facade expected of a royal guard, no one had touched him with kindness since. He'd returned from deployment. Agent Collins was speaking urgently into his radio, probably explaining to his superiors why his principal was currently holding hands with an armed British soldier during what appeared to be a psychological emergency. Palace security guards were moving closer, but they seemed as uncertain as everyone else about how to handle such an unprecedented situation. The protesters, meanwhile, had noticed that something unusual was happening. The crowd's attention was beginning to shift from their demonstration to the strange tableau of an American senator comforting a royal guard. Cameras were clicking rapidly, and Margaret realized that photos of this moment would be on the front page of newspapers around the world within hours. But she couldn't think about that now. James was looking directly at her for the first time, really seeing her instead of staring through her at some remembered battlefield. His breathing was still rapid, but it was no longer the shallow panting of someone in full panic. "What's your home like?" she asked, keeping her hand steady over his. "Tell me about something peaceful from before your deployment." James's lips moved slightly, though no sound came out. Royal guards weren't supposed to speak while on duty, but Margaret could see him fighting the urge to respond. The human connection was pulling him back from whatever dark place his mind had taken him to. "My garden," he whispered, so quietly that only Margaret could hear him. The words were a violation of every rule he'd been taught, but they seemed to come from somewhere deeper than military training. "My mom's garden in Yorkshire. She grows roses." Margaret smiled, feeling some of the tension leave his hands. "What color roses?" "Pink ones, and yellow ones by the kitchen window." His voice was stronger now, and she could see that talking about home was grounding him in the present moment. The crowd was growing curious about their interaction, and several protesters had stopped chanting to watch what was happening at the guard post. A police inspector was approaching with obvious intention to intervene, but Collins intercepted him and began what appeared to be a very rapid explanation of the situation. "Tell me about the smell of those roses," Margaret continued, keeping. James focused on memories that were safe and peaceful instead of the traumatic ones that had been overwhelming him. "Sweet. Especially in the morning when there's still dew on them." James was speaking more freely now, though still quietly enough that the conversation remained private despite the public setting. A reporter had managed to get close enough to overhear parts of their exchange, and Margaret could see him frantically scribbling notes. The story was already writing itself in his head. American senator's extraordinary intervention saves British Guard from crisis. But the immediate crisis wasn't over yet. James was calmer, but he was still holding a loaded rifle in the middle of a crowd, and his psychological state remained fragile. One wrong sound, one unexpected movement, could still trigger another episode. That's when Margaret heard something that made her heart sink. In the distance, the sound of sirens was approaching. Someone had called for emergency services, probably reporting an armed individual in distress. Within minutes, the area would be flooded with police cars, ambulances, possibly military personnel. James heard the sirens too, and Margaret felt his hands tense under hers. To someone dealing with combat trauma, the sound of emergency vehicles could be just as triggering as crowd noise or sudden movements. She had to get him away from his post and into a safe environment before the situation escalated beyond anyone's control. But moving a royal guard from his assigned position during duty hours would require authorization that would take far too long to obtain. Margaret looked around desperately, trying to find someone with enough authority to authorize James's temporary relief from duty. The sirens were getting louder, and she could see panic starting to creep back into his eyes. The approaching emergency vehicles represented exactly the kind of high-stress, high-noise situation that could push him back into a full psychological crisis. Then she spotted a figure she recognized from diplomatic briefings, Colonel Elizabeth Hartwell, the commanding officer responsible for the Royal Guards at Westminster. The colonel was striding across the courtyard with the purposeful gait of someone who had been informed of an unusual situation and was coming to assess it personally. "Colonel Hartwell," Margaret called out, finally releasing James's hands, but staying close enough to intervene if necessary. "Senator Hayes, we have a situation here that requires immediate attention." The colonel approached with the kind of professional composure that comes from decades of military service. She took in the scene quickly: the American senator, the visibly distressed guard, the gathering crowd, and the approaching emergency vehicles. Her expression remained neutral, but Margaret could see her making rapid calculations about how to handle what was clearly an unprecedented situation. Senator Hayes, Colonel Hartwell said crisply, "I've been briefed on your intervention. What exactly is the nature of the problem?"
Accurate.
Chose her words carefully, aware that anything she said could affect James's career and future. "Your guardsman is experiencing what appears to be combat-related stress. He needs immediate relief from his post and access to appropriate support services." James remained at attention, but Margaret could see him listening intently to every word of the conversation that would determine his fate. His breathing had stabilized, but the approaching sirens were clearly making him nervous again. Colonel Hartwell studied James with the practiced eye of an officer who had seen her share of soldiers struggling with the aftermath of deployment. "Guardsman Mitchell," she said formally, "you were temporarily relieved of your post. Report to the duty officer immediately for debriefing." The relief in James's posture was visible, but he still hadn't moved from his position. Years of military discipline weren't easily overcome, even when dealing with a psychological emergency. "James," Margaret said gently, "it's okay to step away now. You've done your duty, and now it's time to take care of yourself." Finally, James took a step back. From his post, his rifle still held at the proper angle, but his stance noticeably less rigid. The simple act of moving seemed to break the spell that had held him frozen between his training and his trauma. The first police car arrived at that moment, its sirens wailing as it pulled up to the palace gates. The sound sent a visible shudder through James, but this time he was prepared for it. Instead of triggering another panic attack, it seemed to strengthen his resolve to get away from the source of stress. Agent Collins approached Margaret cautiously. "Ma'am, we really need to get you inside now. The situation out here is becoming ... complicated." Indeed it was. The media had caught wind that something unusual was happening. Reporters were pushing through the crowd trying to get close enough to document whatever story was unfolding. Photos of Margaret's interaction with James were already being transmitted around the world. She knew that by evening, everyone would be speculating about what had happened. But Margaret wasn't ready to leave yet. She turned to Colonel Hartwell with the same intensity she brought to important Senate negotiations. "Colonel, this young man needs proper psychological support, not disciplinary action. What happened here today wasn't a failure of duty, it was a consequence of serving his country in combat." The colonel nodded slowly. "Understand your concern, Senator. Guardsman Mitchell will receive appropriate evaluation and support. The Army has protocols for these situations." James had been listening to their exchange and finally spoke up again, his voice stronger than before. "Senator Hayes," he said, looking directly at her, "thank you for seeing me as a person instead of just a uniform." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of months of isolation and struggle. Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes, not from sadness but from the recognition of a shared moment of human connection that had transcended all the barriers of protocol, nationality, and circumstance. The crowd of protesters had largely forgotten about their original demonstration, captivated instead by the drama unfolding at the guard post. Some were taking photos with their phones. Others were simply watching with the fascination that people have for unexpected moments of genuine emotion in public spaces. Colonel Hartwell gestured to a junior officer who had appeared at her side. "Please escort Guardsman Mitchell to the medical facility for evaluation and ensure that this matter is handled with appropriate sensitivity." As James prepared to leave his post, he turned back to Margaret one more time. "The roses," he said, quietly. "I'm going to call my mom tonight and ask about the roses." 3 months later, Margaret received an envelope with a British postmark addressed to her Senate office in Washington. Inside was a photograph that made her smile immediately, a beautiful garden filled with pink and yellow roses in full bloom, with a handwritten note on the back. "Senator Hayes, my mom wanted you to see her garden. Thank you for helping me find my way back to it. James Mitchell." The incident at Westminster Palace had made international headlines, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Instead of focusing on the protest or the trade negotiations, the media had been captivated by the story of an American senator who stepped into an intense confrontation with a royal guard and managed to defuse a potential crisis through simple Human compassion. The photographs of Margaret holding James's hands while he struggled with his demons had become iconic, appearing on magazine covers and in newspaper editorials about the importance of recognizing and addressing combat trauma. Mental health advocates used the images to illustrate how PTSD could affect anyone, anywhere, and how intervention could make the difference between tragedy and recovery. Back in London, James had indeed called his mother that night and many nights since. The conversation about roses had led to conversations about his deployment, his struggles, and his need for help. Colonel Hartwell had been true to her word. Instead of facing disciplinary action, James had been connected with counseling services and a support network of other veterans dealing with similar challenges. The Royal Guards had quietly implemented new protocols for recognizing and addressing psychological stress among their ranks. While the incident had initially embarrassed some officials who were concerned about breaches of protocol, the overwhelming public response had been supportive of both James and the institution that ultimately prioritized his well-being over rigid adherence to ceremony. Margaret's own political career had been affected as well, though not in ways she had anticipated. Her approval ratings had actually increased after the incident, with constituents appreciating her willingness to put human decency ahead of diplomatic protocol. The trade agreement she had been negotiating was ultimately successful, but it included new provisions for worker mental health support that had been inspired by her experience with James. Agent Collins, who had initially been concerned about his principal's unconventional behavior, later admitted that he had learned something important about the difference between protecting someone's physical safety and protecting their humanity. He had requested additional training in recognizing psychological crises, becoming an advocate within the Secret Service for better mental health awareness. The story had also inspired others to pay attention to veterans' struggles in ways they hadn't before. Margaret began receiving letters from military families sharing their own stories of loved ones dealing with combat trauma. She used her platform in the Senate to push for increased funding for veterans' mental health services, often referencing that rainy afternoon in London, when she learned that sometimes the most important diplomatic work happens not in conference rooms, but in moments of human crisis. James himself had become an unofficial spokesperson for PTSD awareness, speaking at events about the importance of seeking help and the reality that psychological wounds from combat were just as real and deserving of treatment as physical injuries. He remained with the Royal Guards, but with a new role that included peer support for other soldiers struggling with similar challenges. The photograph of the roses became a symbol for both of them, a reminder that healing was possible, that connections could be made across any barrier, and that sometimes the most profound impacts come from the simplest gestures of human kindness. Years later, when asked about that afternoon at Westminster Palace, Margaret would always say the same thing: "I didn't save anyone that day. We saved each other." She kept the photograph of the roses on her desk in the Senate, a reminder that in a world full of complex international relations and political maneuvering, sometimes the most important diplomacy happens between two people who are willing to see past uniforms and titles to the human being underneath. The crowd that had gathered to protest that day had long since moved on to other causes, and the media had found new stories to tell. But for Margaret and James, the memory of those few crucial minutes remained vivid, a testament to the power of compassion to bridge any divide and transform a moment of crisis into a lifetime of connection and healing.